guess that mic is working. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Clarice Smith lecture this evening with scholar, curator Shirley Reece-Hughes, and I am Randy Griffey, head curator here at SAM. A gentle reminder as we begin tonight, just to silence your phones. The Smithsonian American Art Museum established the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lectures in American Art in 2004 to present new insights into American art from the perspectives of outstanding artists, critics, and scholars. This annual series takes place each fall and is made possible by the generosity of Clarice Smith, who departed us in 2021. This, our 20th year of the series, is also our final. We thank you for joining us over the last 2 decades for many memorable speakers and lectures. Rest assured, we will continue to have lectures as we go forward, and I encourage you to sign up for our mailing list to be informed of upcoming programs. This evening, we gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are gathered, and the labor of the people who were enslaved in constructing this historic building. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome Shirley Reece-Hughes to our stage. Reece-Hughes is curator of paintings, sculpture, and works on paper at the Amon Carter Museum of Art in Fort Worth, Texas. Reece-Hughes established the Amon Carter's first gallery devoted to rotations of Texas art in 2013, featuring the first exhibition and accompanying catalog of living women artists. And that project was titled Commanding Space, Women Sculptors of Texas in 2018. She has organized numerous exhibitions, including A New American Sculpture, 1914 to 1945, Lachaise, Laurent, Nadelman, and Zorak in 2017, and Anila Kwanyum Aga, A Beautiful Despair in 2021. In her more than a decade at the Amon Carter, Reece-Hughes has fostered the growth of its 20th century collection, acquiring major works by Ruth Osawa, George Bellows, Norman Lewis, and Henry Ossawa Tanner. This evening, she discusses her new exhibition, The World Outside, Louise Nevelson at Mid-Century, describing Nevelson's multifaceted interests and relentless drive to create new modes of making and experiencing art. Situating the artist's life and work within America's changing economies, the space race, and the rise of environmentalism, Reece-Hughes explores how Nevelson inspired viewers to contemplate humankind's place in the cosmos through her art. And also, Shirley, as you know, we have a very nice Nevelson upstairs in our newly reopened modern and contemporary galleries, which I hope you've all been able to enjoy. Shirley and I are also connected as proud Jayhawks, graduates of the University of Kansas in Lawrence, and we share a mentor in the former SAM director, Charlie Eldridge. We will have time for questions and comments at the end of the program. For those joining online and who are subscribed to our YouTube channel, please use the comment section to ask questions at the end of the program. For those in person, please use the comment card inside your program, and these will be collected at also at the end of the lecture. Finally, we invite those of you who are with us tonight in person to join us for a reception in the auditorium lobby after the program. So with no further ado, please help me welcome Shirley Reece-Hughes to the stage.
Thank you so much, Randy. What an honor and a privilege it is to be here this evening, and my deepest thanks to the director of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Stephanie Stevish, and the curatorial team for their gracious invitation to speak here tonight. I also want to thank Gloria Kenyon for organizing this event and all of her assistance in coordinating the logistics of my talk this evening. Having just curated an exhibition and catalog, organized an exhibition and catalog on artist Louise Nevelson, the question I have repeatedly received is, why look at Nevelson now? One reason is that historically, curators at the Amon Carter Art Museum have sought to advance new insights into American creativity by producing deep dive projects on works of art in the museum's collection. After opening in 1961, the Carter established a unique acquisition program. While not that many American art institutions were collecting works on paper or photography in the 1960s, the Carter was actively acquiring drawings, watercolors, prints, photographs, and illustrated books. In 1967, shortly after her second fellowship at the Tamron Lithography Workshop, which artist June Wayne established in Los Angeles in 1961 to revive the dying art of lithography, and today is known as Tamron Institute in New Mexico, the Carter acquired a full set of Nevelson's 1967 Tamron lithographs and a pivotal example of one of her 1963 lithographs from her first fellowship at Tamron, examples of which you see on the screen. While working at Tamron in 1963, Nevelson experimented with untried, unconventional methods. In the untitled print you see on the right, Nevelson dramatically contrasted the blackness of the lithography ink with a white doily to create bold imagery that inverted typical gendered associations of needlework's fragility. In decades that followed, the Carter collected one of Nevelson's etchings, and 3 sculptures created at pivotal moments in her career: an early 1930s work in plaster, a 1940s one in ceramic, as well as Nevelson's signature wood assemblage dating from the 1950s. I found Nevelson's relentless drive to explore and experiment fascinating, and her hand is often present in these experimentations as she's aggressively carved into this plaster surface. Nevelson's signature wall assemblages, for which she is best known today, derive from the artist scavenging for wooden debris from New York City litter piles. The artist converted found objects like cabinets, crates, and furniture parts into her signature grid-based walls that she painted primarily monochromatic black, but also later white or gold. In her landmark work, Sky Cathedral, from 1958, Nevelson deployed an astounding array of found wooden shards and objects, including broken boards, logs, slats, turned balusters, newels, finials, moldings, frames, and table legs, which she cut, dowed, and arranged into boxes. At mid-century, Nevelson had upended and reinvented sculptural processes, repurposing non-art materials through hands-on techniques, dipping her found objects into a can of over-the-counter Rust-Oleum matte black. I got that question a lot. Which paint did she use? Over-the-counter Rust-Oleum. Before, and letting them dry before configuring them into her sculptures. By doing so, the artist defied the post-World War II vogue for welded metal sculpture, championed by her male contemporaries, such as Harry Bertoia, Herbert Ferber, and David Smith. And yet, Nevelson has occupied an almost awkward spot in American art history. She's not been recognized for all that she accomplished. During her lifetime, the artist was portrayed as an isolated recluse, building sculptures that critics refer to as personal worlds or private universes, somehow untethered from the world of experience. Nevelson helped perpetuate this myth of an isolated sorceress, donning a witch's hat in this Life magazine feature story from 1958. Creating an exhibition and a catalog on the artist offered the opportunity to present a more nuanced picture of Nevelson and how her interactions with, quote, the world outside, unquote, a phrase she used, informed her sculptures. The legacy of her achievements as a pioneer of site-specific installations, privileging the viewer's perspective, and the way she expanded materials, everyday materials meanings to draw awareness to our surroundings continues to influence working artists like Leonardo Drew, Tara Donovan, Jean Shin, and Shakaya Booker, whom credit Nevelson as a vital forerunner for their own works that at times allude to or evoke environmental issues related to climate change. Brooklyn-based artist Leonardo Drew, who I worked with on the site-specific installation number 235T that's currently on view at the Carter, said to me, quote, "I stand on Nevelson's shoulders," end quote. While Drew does not work with found objects, he laboriously carves, strips, oxidizes, paints, and assembles his materials to evoke nature's cycles of degeneration and regeneration. Through his bursting profusion of objects that pulsate in a grid format like Nevelson used, Drew inspires us to contemplate our relationships with materiality and our roles in affecting the natural universe. In her essay titled Qualitative Quantities for the World Outside Catalog, artist Tara Donovan writes about her encounters with Nevelson, stating, quote, "Seeing her stacked walls was one of the first instances where I understood the relationship between art and architecture as one where the room itself becomes the frame, which was truly revelatory for me as I developed my own practice of site-responsive installations," end quote. In Haze, Donovan transmuted tens of thousands of clear plastic straws in a field whose shifting facade evokes a cloudscape or snowstorm and intensifies as viewers interact with it, drawing attention to how our mass consumption of straws, which we largely ignore, inextricably ties us to and forever alters nature. For the World Outside catalog, Jean Shin also contributed a reflection essay on Nevelson titled, quote, "A World Within, a Universe Beyond," writing, "In our penchant for what is cast off, Nevelson and I are kindred spirits. Rescuing and repurposing society's discards as a creative practice is a choice to participate in a regenerative cycle." Shin recycled dying maple trees from the former alley at Storm King Art Center, had them cut horizontally to expose their inner core and to form a table and benches for visitors to share. A lay gathering preserves the memory of the lost vista in a new form, bringing attention to tree health and its impact on our ecosystem. Like the model of Nevelson's Looking to Detritus on streets of New York City, Chakaya Booker took inspiration from observing the excessive tire retreads and melted pools of rubber from car fires in New York in the 1980s. She cut and slashed rubber tires into an abstract installation for the Renwick Gallery titled Anonymous Donor in 2015. Booker absorbed the timelessness of Nevelson's work when she stated, quote, "I do not see or relate to her work as historical, out of my time, or non-contemporary," end quote. Tonight, I will discuss how Nevelson's engagement with everyday castaway materials starting in her youth, which he translated into a mature aesthetic, intersected with ecological discoveries and realities at mid-century as the artist devised artistic environmental strategies that resonate today. Born in 1899 and passing in 1988, Nevelson's life straddled the major economic, scientific, and socio-political events that gave rise to environmentalism. Its history in the United States is dynamic, involving various ideas and approaches from individual to public crusades dating back to the beginnings of industrialization. By the early 20th century, more communities were actively protesting industrial air and water pollution and fighting to protect wildlife and natural spaces. Such local protests coalesced into broader discussions about the Earth's fragility after the detonation of the atomic bombs, as environmentalism became a vital cause among conservationists, ecologists, and progressive lawmakers. Nevelson lived through these seismic realizations about the Earth and the changing habits of American behavior that will affect the planet. She recycled goods during her childhood and experienced the rise of consumer culture in the early 20th century, as well as the need for material sacrifice during World War II, the overabundance and waste of the post-war era, and the turn toward environmental activism in the 1960s and 70s. Nevelson, in fact, achieved her mature environmental approach to sculpture in the 1950s, when the new science of ecology and the space race were in their nascent stages. Rather than being isolated or insular, Nevelson kept abreast of not only modernism in art, but also devising processes related to modernism and devising artworks that reflect her planetary consciousness. Nevelson's work anticipated what the theorist Gene Youngblood described in his 1970 landmark study, Expanded Cinema, as, quote, the artist as ecologist, end quote. Youngblood observed that creative acts had become, quote, not so much the invention of new objects as the revelation of previously unrecognized relationships between existing phenomena, both physical and metaphysical, end quote. Nevelson forecasted this direction in art by translating quotidian objects into tangible yet abstract systems, wherein the interrelationships of her wooden pieces drew analogies to the biotic and abiotic factors of ecosystems. In doing so, the artist reoriented viewers' relationships to both natural and built environments, changing the way we think about our surroundings. Born Leah Berlowski, a Jewish immigrant who left Ukraine to escape religious persecution, she settled with her family in Rockland, Maine in 1903. Like many Jewish immigrants barred from more prominent vocations after entering the United States, Nevelson's father, Isaac Berlowski, first worked as a peddler, deploying bricoleur tactics to make ends meet during Nevelson's early childhood. Berlowski would later establish himself as a successful Maine realtor. As defined by anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, a bricoleur uses whatever is, quote, at hand, end quote, to create. Berlowski scavenged for clothes, rags, and buttons that he peddled door to door while also taking scrap metal and converting it into bullets to sell. Although Berlowski's repairing and repurposing discarded goods was an old world survival technique, bricolage had deep roots in American society. When William Rittenhouse opened the first paper mill in the American colonies in 1690, he followed the original process of paper making by Chinese innovators of the first century who converted rag fibers from cloth and bark into paper. Rittenhouse employed people like the woman in the upper left corner to gather rags that could be recycled into paper. As scholar Susan Strasser explains, quote, everyone was a bricoleur in the pre-industrial household of the American colonies and later on the frontier. Saving and using scraps was a matter of course. Even with the rise of consumer culture at the turn of the 20th century, Strasser points out most Americans continued to hand down, mend, repair, reuse, and save clothing, metals, and home furnishings, among other items. These practices represented a cyclical waste and recycling system that virtually disappeared by 1930, after solid waste management was available in virtually every United States city. Growing up in the 1910s, Nevelson was familiar with reusing goods. According to the artist's biographer, Lori Wilson, Nevelson, like her father, scavenged and collected almost anything as a child that would later impact her work. In the 1960s, Nevelson, for example, explored the expressive potential of recycled cloth in her Tamarind lithographic prints. And works such as Untitled One, for instance, Nevelson ran ink cheesecloths on lithographic stones to make this positive textured image. Its tattered appearance seems reminiscent of the threadbare discarded rags Berlowski pelted in Maine. For Nevelson, finding, touching, and repurposing everyday objects was a way for her to, quote, to understand this universe, to see the world clearer. I could only understand through working, end quote. Nevelson began her artistic career after divorcing shipping magnate Charles Nevelson in 1931. Around 1933, the artist began a more than 20-year study of modern dance in New York City with Ellen Kearns, who taught a physical technique that harmonized the mind and body. Quote, I became aware of every fiber, Nevelson said of the experience, and it freed me, end quote. After a few years of dance lessons, Nevelson had explored classical figural studies, but these drawings became increasingly freer in form. As she looked to expanding or suggesting movement on a flattened plane. The style was also linked to surrealism that Nevelson had studied in Germany, in Munich, Germany, with Hans Hofmann, who taught her the fundamentals of not only surrealism, but cubism, evidenced by the artist's spontaneous figural drawings or the cuber box she uses to build her assemblages. Their works are not only informed by Nevelson's knowledge of dance and surrealism, but the experimental choreography of Martha Graham, whom Nevelson viewed as a kindred spirit, attending many of her performances. As Jane Deeney addresses in her essay, Dance Was Carrying America, Louise Nevelson in the 1930s in the catalog, Graham devised movements that carved the world around her to address the mundane so that she could reach her audience. Nevelson's plaster sculpture of a kneeling dancer with arms folded, as Deeney notes, is weighted to the earth in such a way that it suggests the bodily positions of Graham's solo ballet Lamentation, a photo of which is on the right. In this performance, Graham expressed the emotions of loss and grief through sharp, angular movements of her arms and legs while remaining seated almost the entire time. By the 1940s, Nevelson was exploring movement in three dimensions with clay. She formed a group titled Moving Static Figures with steel rods that enable the ceramic elements to rotate and anticipate the modular approach Nevelson used in her walls. Nevelson turned to found objects as her primary material in the early 1940s after America entered World War II, when doing without was part of daily existence. In 1942, the United States government began a rationing system, starting with tires and eventually setting purchasing limits on coffee, sugar, butter, and meat. The government also initiated its Salvage for Victory campaign in 1942, calling for donations of scraps, metal, rubber, rags, silk, and cooking fats, items that could then be alchemized into military needs, such as bullets, tanks, parachutes, and nitroglycerin. With her bricolage roots, Nevelson implicitly understood how surplus goods were transformable. Quote, "I don't think you can touch a thing that cannot be rehabilitated into another life," end quote. Scholars have often linked Nevelson's etching experiments at the avant-garde printmaking workshop, Atelier 17, first in 1948 and then again in 1950 and 54, as spurring her shift from the subtractive method of carving to the additive method of sculpture. In the etching you see in the middle, Moon Goddess, the shadowy presence of the figure forecasts Nevelson assemblages of found objects in boxes of layered forms that emerge and disappear in a play of shadows. One of her first boxes there from 1950 is on the right. Scholars like Mary Coffey, who also wrote for the catalog, have explored the importance of Nevelson's trips to see Maya art in Mexico and Guatemala in 1950 and 1951, respectively. As Coffey notes, the scale and engravings of Maya art at Uxmal, Chichen Itza, and especially Quirigua had the greatest impact on Nevelson's work. Yet the wartime and military and community lifestyle of collecting, salvaging, and stacking materials stayed with Nevelson. She described how during World War II she could not escape the impact of, quote, the atmosphere in the world. During the war, there was a shortage of materials, and I decided that creativity was the important thing, and I would see things that I could use everywhere. I always wanted to show the world that art is everywhere, except it has to pass through a creative mind. I began to see things, almost anything along the street, as art. Anywhere I found wood, I took it home and started working with it. Nevelson's first thematic installation using found wood, metal, glass, and electric lights was titled Circus. The Clown is the Center of His World at Norlis Gallery in 1943. Marcel Duchamp's found object art, the surrealist, whimsical use of secondhand items, Joseph Cornell's shadow boxes, and Alexander Calder's circus tableau were all important precedents for Nevelson's Norlis show. In an interview with Dorothy Gies Seckler, I think, for the Archives of American Art, Nevelson recalled that she composed works for the circus from, quote, the imagery of mankind, end quote. And indeed, this earliest art environment, there we go. This earliest art environment contemplated the ramifications of society's trash. After her 1943 showing, Nevelson turned solely to wood, particularly furniture and lumber debris, creating a succeeding group of exhibitions from 1955 to 1957 that included Ancient Games and Ancient Places, Royal Voyage, and the Forest, which anticipated what Alan Caprow famously claimed in 1958 was art's next direction after Jackson Pollock's passing. Quote, objects of every sort are materials for new art, end quote. These exhibitions reflected Nevelson's process-based engagement with everyday life that attuned her to the atomic age. As she reflected, no matter how individual we are as humans, we are composite of everything that we are aware of. We are the mirror of our times. After the detonation of the atomic bombs in World War II and their fateful implications for the planet, scientific and public interest in the Earth expanded exponentially. In 1955, the Winter Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research sponsored the first international scientific symposium that addressed what man has done and is doing to change his physical, biological environment on the Earth. Between December 8th, 1952 and December 20th, 1954, Life magazine produced the popular series, The World We Live In, that addressed subjects ranging from the formation of the Earth, the geography of the oceans, the ecology of the Arctic, deserts, woodlands, and rainforests, to the history of mammals and sea life. The world we live in visually and descriptively explained basic sciences like airflow through the Earth's surfaces. The Life series also immersed readers in new environments through panoramic gatefolds, often painted by Rudolf Zallinger, who, for instance, spent 2 months studying Suriname's rainforests before illustrating its unique plant and animal ecosystem for Life's September 1954 issue. In the 1950s, books such as The Triumph of the Tree by John Siracalis and The Sea Around Us by marine biologist Rachel Carson stirred unprecedented interest in ecology. 10 years later, Carson rang the alarm for emergent ecological concerns with her most acclaimed work, Silent Spring, which detailed the harmful effects of synthetic pesticides on the environment. In 1955, potentially tapping into America's interest in the Earth, Nevelson abstracted the globe sculpturally in the thematic installation, Ancient Games and Ancient Places. The artist recalled in her autobiography, Dawns and Dust, that the show was, quote, an environment no one was ready for, end quote. At this time, Nevelson was creating tabletop sculptures, such as Night Landscape, that feature furniture parts and dead tree limbs to evoke a cityscape or a jungle that at night could be viewed in the round, and alluded to the degradation of the environment. 2 years after Ancient Games and Ancient Places, Nevelson created an arboreal environment reminiscent of her main surroundings in the forest at Grand Central Moderns. In the forest, the artist composed landscape tableaux that suggested dense clusters of trees, seemingly extracted from their natural habitats. Like Collis's warnings about deforestation in The Triumph of the Tree, Nevelson hinted at society's disregard for woodlands through her gallery space filled with disposed timber, masterfully crafted into sculpture. At the gallery's entrance, the artist left a tray of wooden castaways for visitors to make their own creations, becoming active participants in Nevelson's concept of art making, while also being reminded that what they and others discard every day had value. In her interview with Seckler for the Archives of American Art, Nevelson recalled that the first boxed assemblage she created was from a tall carpet box, like the one in the Smithsonian Institution. As she explained, I didn't use small pieces of wood, but I found lumber on the street and that it had nails, and some nails holes in it in different forms and different shapes. And I just nailed them together, and I knew this was art, end quote. In 1946, okay, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. In 1946, Life magazine composed a scene titled Family Utopia, stating that it was based on hard statistics of consumer demand and manufacturers' unfilled orders of appliances, cars, TV, and outdoor play equipment, among other products. Nevelson's recovery of disposed materials on the street attuned her to this era of excessive production, materialism, and waste, commenting at the time, quote, "People are just too greedy. They want all the things they can get," end quote. The artist conceived her sculptural walls crammed with people's unwanted goods into cubicles, as these enclosures exude an excess of materiality. By 1956, the understanding that industrialization and radiation alters the Earth's ecosystems, the phrase "the environment" as we understand it today, referring to the complex physical, chemical, and biotic factors such as climate and soil that affect living things, entered the American vernacular. Nevelson appeared astutely aware of industrialization's fraught environmental impact, stating, quote, "Don't forget that this country was so rich in natural resources, and we've been exploiting it, the redwoods, the water, et cetera, and we've taken out the materials from the earth," end quote. In 1958, Nevelson pioneered the idea of an artistic environment with her site-specific installation titled Moon Garden +1. Nevelson said the one represented the viewer and their interaction with the work. Featuring monochromatic black wood sculptures illuminated by only blue light bulbs, Nevelson's sculptures scaled the walls, lay on the floor, and even hung from the ceiling, challenging viewers to see these objects in near total darkness. The artist described it as, quote, "This is the universe, the stars, the moon, and you and I, everyone." By then, Nevelson was referring to Moon Garden +1 and the immersive installation she created afterwards, Sky Columns Presence, as environments. These all-surround installations reflected Nevelson's planetary awareness during the space race, which ranged from the 1950s to the 1970s. While her sculptures are abstract, she repeatedly used words like lunar, moon, night, and sky to title her art, as Nevelson potentially contemplated humankind's place in the cosmos. Quote, "We are in tune with the sun, the moon, airplane," she stated. "We must go forward. There is no turning back. Intelligence is too limited in creating. We must draw on extrasensory perception, something beyond." In 1959, NASA's Explorer 6 broadcast the first televised picture from outer space, including the first images of Earth taken from an extraterrestrial vantage point, which is in the middle, which bear an uncanny resemblance to some of Nevelson's 1963 series of Tamron lithographs. At this time, the artist described her sculptural walls as living communities, explaining that they functioned like ecosystems. Quote, "Each niche lives and encloses its own life. Colonies in each cell strengthens and support its neighbors. Place the cells wherever you wish. You are restructuring, not destroying, because life is in both the parts and the whole," end quote. Neville's description of her work as living organisms was reinforced by mid-century critic Robert Rosenblum, who commented that her works exude, quote, "the sense that the whole exists in an inanimate state, almost transforming itself as we observe it," end quote. A photograph of Sky Chapel No. 1 in the home of longtime Nevelson supporters and collectors Howard and Jean Lippman shows how her work was adaptable. Installed against a black wall, which hides the open spaces between the boxes, the work appears more relief-like than three-dimensional. In 1959, Nevelson created the monochromatic white installation titled Dawn's Wedding Feast for Dorothy C. Miller's 16 Americans exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. The color and sculptural components recall the stately colonial houses in Rockland, Maine, where the artist grew up, feeling like an outsider as a Jewish immigrant. This Middle Street was actually a place where her music teacher lived, and she talked later about how intimidated she felt going there. For Dawn's Wedding Feast, the artist reclaimed and inverted her past by sourcing some of the wood from her hometown to create sculptural components that allow viewers to become involved participants. The artist had hoped to sell Dawn's Wedding Feast as a total environment, but since there were no takers, she broke down, salvaged, and reconstructed works such as Dawn's Wedding Chapel No. 2 and Case with Balusters. If you notice, this is an original photograph of the installation, and you see the case with balusters at the bottom there that she then turned into a freestanding sculpture, or the box in the middle that looks like it has almost a paintbrush jar that she then recombined into this. So Nevelson not only recycled wooden debris, but she recycled her own work. By 1960, Nevelson began experimenting with gold to unify her sculptures, seeing the color as dialectical, as part of nature, stating, quote, "Gold comes out of the earth. It's like the sun, it's like the moon. And when you put it on, it's an essence of so-called reality in the universe," end quote, and representing splendor, quote, "an abundance, and that abundance is really materialistic," end quote. In painting America's discarded debris gold and placing it in receptacles, Nevelson perhaps asked viewers to contemplate the excessiveness of materialism. In wanting to express something beyond, Nevelson experimented with plexiglass, stating, quote, "I'm not a capitalist, but I could take that material, which for a better definition we'll call fourth dimensional, because it's like water. You can see through it. You can move it around." For her 1967 retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Nevelson created tropical rainforest in the opening passageway to the show. Nevelson had experienced Quirigua, Guatemala's tropical rainforest in 1951, remarking in Dawns and Dusk, quote, "We can only live by the earth. We come from earth and dust," end quote. Nevelson exuded her reverence for the planet's most sophisticated biome with Rainforest Wall. The prefabricated, multi-compartmentalized boxes signal the complex interdependent parts of a rainforest. Two columns covered with leaf-shaped wood represent conifers, standing between three gridded walls teeming with balls, each secluded in a box at various depths. Hidden, though sometimes poking out, these balls are reminiscent of the furtive creatures that inhabit the rainforest, which more than any other ecosystem supports the greatest number and variety of animals. By the late 1960s, Nevelson experimented with wall-mounted works, trying to abstract what the grand processes that underpin life on Earth and beyond into large wall-mounted works. The artist simulated the idea of seeing a region from space or bird's eye view in Night Zag Wall, created after she and many Americans had witnessed William Anders' dramatic photograph, Earthrise, of 1968. In Night Zag Wall, Nevelson alluded to the totalizing forces that shape existence, humanity, and nature, and pursued this path late into her career with such large-scale works as Sky Cathedral, here as Randy mentioned earlier, upstairs, where massive wooden forms evoke everyday materiality, mechanical circuitry, and nature's forms. And she created this work only 6 years before her death. In 1966, Nevelson began making outdoor sculptures with networks of open forms that incorporate natural light and surroundings, and which the artist titled Atmosphere and Environment, epitomizing her interest in creating works that envelop the viewer in abstract references to air and earth. Nevelson's interest in framing light dates back to this view of her home in 1958, where she devised a wooden framework in one of the windows to her home that could shape the sun's rays. Nevelson's Atmosphere and Environment outdoor series was made from Corten steel and anticipated artists of the land or earth art movement like Nancy Holt, who similarly harnessed the sun's rays for viewers to contemplate. In the 1970s, Nevelson acted as a featured artist in symposia addressing outdoor environmental sculpture. Conversations revolved around how an environment's cultural, political, economic, and social conditions might affect an artist's work, or how their work might change the outlook of the inhabitants surrounding the art. The establishment of Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, ushered in an unprecedented era of environmental consciousness that reached all strata of society, with President Nixon creating the Environmental Protection Agency a year later. Ecology had become a public and artistic movement, reportedly, quote, the one political issue that the country may be united, end quote. Not anymore. Nelson's relentless curiosity for using the concrete to express science revelation of things too infinite to grasp in sculptural form paved the way for generations of artists. Thank you.
Gloria is coming around. Microphone?
I have a microphone. If you have, invite you to pull out the comment card, and we also have pencils if you need to ask your questions. And for those of you online, you can just drop them in the chat. And my wonderful staff will bring them up to me. I'll go ahead and take that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shirley. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Much appreciated. For those of you who don't know, I'm Gloria Kenyon. I'm the head of public programs here at SAM. And we'll get started with this first question. For how many years was the American Book Award a Louise Nevelson sculpture? And do you know how many in total were made?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the way I'm reading this is the American Book Award, what the award as it was given was a Louise Nevelson sculpture. And how many in total were made? For how many years?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm following the question. Book award.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the American Book Award,
In 1981, the American Book Award was a Louise Nevelson sculpture. It was about a foot square.
Ah,
And I was wondering how many years did that go on and how many of those sculptures were made?
so that was 1981, and she passed in 1988. So I'm not certain on the amount, but that's reflective of, that moment where she was starting to garner more attention in the 1980s to receive an award like that.
No, she didn't receive the award. The American Book Award itself was a Louise Nevelson sculpture.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I worked on a book that won.
Oh, congratulations.
The award, and I remember it took a long time to get it because they had production problems in fabricating.
That still happens today.
Looking online, a lot of them will come up at auction, so I was wondering if anybody knew how many of them were actually made.
That's a good question. Probably, would require some research into the publisher. sometimes they'll tell you when you're looking up a book how many they made.
Thank you. I feel like we all just learned a lot about the American Book Award.
Yeah, thank you.
Especially in the 80s. We have another question is, can you talk a little bit more about Nevelson's monochromatic palette and what drew her to that and why that's such a hallmark of her work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nevelson often said, because people said, oh, you love wood. And she said, well, if I loved wood so much, why would I paint it monochromatic black or white or gold? But I think what Nevelson was trying to do with monochromy was create works that would transcend. So in other words, when we think about assemblage at that moment that she was working, so often artists like Joseph Cornell or Robert Rauschenberg, you saw the disparity of works, of objects that they incorporated in their assemblages. And Nevelson, honestly, she was metaphysical in many ways, and she often talked about the fourth dimension. So for her, uniting her work through monochromy, whether black, white, or gold, was a way to create works that transcended the original identity of the objects. But if you look at them, what's fascinating is you can still see the identity of those objects. They're still very clear. We have a work where a Windsor chair, a bedpost. So really, I think it was her intention to create works that were transcendental. She wanted people to feel moved and think beyond what was more literal, I would say, than what she gathered and put together.
Thank you. A couple of questions from this card. So we'll start with, did she have other female artists with whom she collaborated? What were her collaborations like?
That's a great question. She didn't collaborate with Louise Bourgeois. I didn't have time to go into her work, but they were friends and colleagues. And really, Bourgeois and her were two artists that were, we can't imagine how difficult it was for women artists at mid-century, particularly women artists who wanted to be sculptors. Nevelson faced a backlash and critique that really is hard to fathom, and so did Bourgeois. So they supported one another. But one of the things that I think you can see kind of a connection with Nevelson's work and Bourgeois was working from an environmental strategy too. I think with the difference with Bourgeois, she was so fluid and explored different kinds of modes of working. But Nevelson, around in the 1950s, created an entire room of what she called personages, and they were wooden columnar works. And what was unusual about them, she filled them in the gallery space, is it was one of the first times where visitors would walk up and literally be sort of eye to eye with this work. So they did not collaborate together, but they certainly knew one another and supported one another.
Thank you. Did Louise Nevelson ever teach the arts, and if so, where?
Yes, she taught, after divorcing her husband in 1933, Nevelson went to teach for the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. And she actually taught at this Flatbush Boys Club. And she even said at the time, and I think she enjoyed teaching, but that was really her only stint where she did it. She was often a lecturer during her lifetime at various colleges and symposia, but that was really the critical moment where she was teaching in the 1930s.
Great. This one's very art specific. What kind of hardware did she use for building these assemblages?
So Nevelson often left, so the nails, whatever nails were popular at mid-century, that's what she used. And when you look at her work really closely from that era, the nails, she just left the nails sticking out. So I think maybe what the question is also getting to is how did she configure her pieces into those boxes? So part of it, she actually used a glue gun and glued some of them in, but then she also would nail them in. And so the boxes, when we actually install the works, the boxes are literally just stacked on one another. So there's that free-form modularity that Nevelson pioneered, you have to go through if you want to install a show. And part of the trick is, because the boxes may not be all the same, is how do you stack them carefully according to the directions that were provided. So glue gun and nails at that time, that was her main use of anchoring pieces.
Interesting. I feel like I could do that too. I feel inspired. So this one is a long question, but I think is very interesting about how work is installed. And I'm sorry to whoever's question is, I'm going to edit for time and clarity. I was struck in the photos that you showed of the sculptures in their original installations. They were tightly enclosed, particularly by the ceiling, versus the way we see them in the museums today. Could you speak to a different and changing approach to just how folks display her work?
That's a great question. Nevelson honestly hoped that people would buy these sculptures as installations, and no one were takers. And in fact, her Moon Garden +1, she was trying to sell for $18,000. I'll have to go back in time. But she could not sell them like that way. So she broke them apart to make them saleable. And I think her desire was to, and what she pioneered really, was that kind of sculptural enclosure that allowed people, I was trying to get to the Moon Garden +1 slide, but sort of surrounded people. And so the challenge then became, and I think she realized that after doing these immersive installations, that they would not sell. So that's why she shifted to a process of large-scale walls or wall-mounted works, because she knew that they were objects that could be purchased. And as you can imagine, it would be difficult to put a full-scale installation in your home as a patron. So that is how they're installed today. The 2007 show of Nevelson's work by the Jewish Museum and the de Young actually recreated her environments. They pulled all those works together to put them in installations. So that was a fascinating experiment and very difficult. A lot of times, and we don't know, and it still happens today, even after that install, where the objects go, because they're broken up and private collectors might sell them. So it's the challenge of, you try to, in our show, when we did a room, I did it in blue lights to try to recreate, with her black matte sculptures, to try to recreate the way Nevelson wanted people to experience those works at mid-century. So it draws your eye in a different way to the objects. It's very unique.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for all of your questions. Thank you again, Shirley, for joining us this evening. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we invite those of you here in the auditorium with us to join us just outside in the lobby for a small reception.